It's no wonder the Bible says it is only the fool who would say in his heart, there is no God. And it never ceases to amaze me how smart we have become in this nation. I mean, we have gotten so smart. Do you know that I grew up in Long Beach, California? When I grew up in Southern California, when I was 5 years old, I went to kindergarten. Do you know that when I was in kindergarten, they told me that a frog turning into a prince was a nursery fairy tale? But you want to know something? When I got to the University of California, you know what they told me? The university told me a frog turned into a prince was science. We've really gotten smart. And we are so smart. Only the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Paul goes on in Romans chapter 1, verse 19 to say, secondly, we know there is a God, not only by what we see in creation. He says, we know there is a God because, number two, God placed in the heart of every person a desire to know him. You know, it's very interesting, folks, that no matter where you go in this world, no matter how sophisticated or primitive the society, people have a desire to know God. Now, where did we get that desire? If we are simply products of impersonal chance. But you see, God, who is personal, created us as personal beings to live in a personal relationship with him. But Paul goes on in the New Testament to say, thirdly, we know there is a God because God has broken into human history. God split history into BC and AD, and he personally revealed himself to us. I was just down in Cuba a couple months ago for the third time. We've been holding pastors' conferences throughout Cuba, and I was with 1,000 Cuban pastors in Havana and Santiago and Bayamo and Gamacue, Cuba. We need to be praying for our Christian brothers and sisters in Cuba. Fidel has just destroyed the country, and right now it's gotten so bad that everybody gets paid the same amount of money in Cuba. Doesn't matter whether you're a plumber, electrician, a teacher, a pastor, a doctor, everybody gets $8 a month by the government. That's their wage, $8 a month. Most Cubans today are down to rice and beans once a day. It's survival. The poverty is overwhelming. And but Fidel, he's holding on. His pride won't allow him to admit that communism has failed. But in spite of that, the church in Cuba is growing like wildfire. And it's been our privilege. We've printed 5,000 copies of my book in Spanish in Cuba, the first Christian book published there since 1959, and it's been exciting to see what God has opened up. But I was sharing with the Cuban pastors down there one of my favorite stories that I've shared around the world. One of those great stories that no matter what culture you're in, people identify with it. I was telling about a father and son who were walking down a dirt path one day, and they came upon an anthill that somebody had stepped on and smashed those ants. Now, do you have ants here in Kennewick? And the little boy who was 4 years old, he looked up to his dad. He said, Daddy, wouldn't it be good if we could go down and tell those ants we love them? You know, tell those ants we care about them and help them with their sick and their wounded. And the father, he put his arm around his little boy. And he said, Son, the only way that we could tell those ants that we love them, that we care about them, is to become an ant. And to live like an ant and talk like an ant. And then by our lives, they would know what we are like. You see, 2,000 years ago, God looked down on a world that he created, a world that he loved. And God said, I want to tell you how much I love you. How was God going to do that? And God said, I will become a man. And I will live like a man and talk like a man. And by my life, you will know what I am like. You see, 2,000 years ago, God invaded human history. The greatest event in human history. He split history into BC and AD, and he personally revealed himself to us. See, the Bible says in Colossians 1:15 that Jesus Christ is the visible expression of the invisible God. Jesus Christ made visible the invisible. People say, how can that be? I mean, folks, right now, bouncing all over this room is Meet the Press, Face the Nation, CNN, Fox, ESPN, football, on and on. It's bouncing all over this room. You can't see it. You can't hear it, but it's here. You know, if I had a little box here called a television set and I turned that box on, all of a sudden those invisible waves that you cannot see, you cannot hear, they'd come into that box and you would see a picture, you would hear sound. The invisible would become visible. You see, the Bible says that Jesus Christ is the visible expression of the invisible God. Jesus Christ, folks, is the television set of God. You ever wonder what God is like? What's God like? If you want to know what God's like, look at Jesus Christ. The Bible says that He is the eternal God come in human flesh. People say, what's so unique about Jesus Christ? What's so unique about Him? I mean, you know, He had no certificates or degrees. He never traveled farther than 150 miles from where He was born. He lived and moved among common people. He was not an author. You know, He wrote no books. He composed no poems. He compiled no documents. He edited no newspapers. He contributed to no periodicals. The only sentence He ever wrote was a single line in the sand, which disappeared the same day. No letter was preserved. He never used a fountain pen or a typewriter or a Microsoft Word. We have no line, word, or syllable from His hand. And yet, do you realize, folks, that more books have been written about Him and His words than any other man? He has affected the lives of more people than all the authors of all the ages put together. The story of His life has now been translated into over 2,500 languages and is read yearly by billions of people. He was not an orator, and yet no person ever spoke like this man. His discourses have become the theme of millions of addresses. His words are simple and clear. Very few adjectives are used, and yet His sentences abound with beauty, meaning, and grace. In fact, today His sayings are hammered into polished marble. They are chiseled into imperishable granite. They are wrought into enduring bronze tablets. They are fashioned in stained glass windows of numberless churches. They are etched in rich mosaics upon temple walls, and they are set today in arched domes of colossal cathedrals. His words are literary gems. He stands today as the unequal seer of all of literature. Shakespeare, Milton, Emerson, folks, they all bow their heads in His presence, recognizing a superior. He was not a poet. And yet He has inspired thousands of poets to utter their most sublime expressions. He was not a musician. And yet He inspired Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Handel, and the list goes on and on. He was not an artist or a sculptor or a painter. And yet He was the inspiration for Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Hoffman, and countless others. He was not a lawyer. And yet He knew the law and applied it to the relationships which would prevail among men. In fact, He Himself became the fountainhead of all of righteousness. He was not a doctor. And yet He healed the sick. He opened blind eyes. He unstopped deaf ears. He cleansed the leopard. And folks, He raised the dead.